April 29, 1945. Stalag XI-B, Lower Saxony, Germany. The wire was down. Not cut cleanly by engineers with proper tools, but crushed flat by the treads of British tanks that had rolled through the gates an hour before dawn. The guard towers stood empty, their machine gun nests abandoned, spent cartridge casings glinting in the morning sun like scattered brass seeds. The air smelled of diesel exhaust, of mud churned up by armored vehicles, of something else, something the women in the eastern compound could not immediately identify. Coffee. Real coffee. Not the roasted acorn substitute they had tasted in captivity, but the genuine article, brewing somewhere beyond the wire where British soldiers had established a command post in what had been the commandant's office that in the women's barracks. 23 Soviet female prisoners stood frozen in a tableau of uncertainty. They were not the thousands who filled the main camp. Those were men. French and British and American prisoners who were already streaming toward the gates, toward freedom, toward the trucks that would carry them home. These 23 occupied a separate section, a compound within a compound, isolated by nationality and gender and the particular shame that Soviet ideology attached to capture. They wore whatever remained of their uniforms, a tunic here, a skirt there, boots held together with wire, heads wrapped in rags that had once been scarves or undershirts. They ranged in age from 19 to 42. They had been soldiers once. Snipers, machine gunners, anti-aircraft crews, tank drivers, radio operators. The Red Army had mobilized nearly 1 million women during the Great Patriotic War, and these 23 represented a fraction of those who had fallen into German hands. Senior Sergeant Yekaterina Michailova, 31 years old, formerly of the 3rd Shock Army, stood at the barracks window and watched British soldiers moving through the camp with a methodical efficiency that seemed almost leisurely compared to the frantic pace of Soviet military operations. They were not rushing. They were not shouting. They moved with the calm purpose of men who had already won and knew it. She counted 8 of them in her immediate field of vision. They wore strange uniforms, khaki, not the field gray of the Germans or the brown of the Soviets, but a color that seemed designed to blend with nothing in particular and everything in general. Their helmets were different too, wider brimmed than German coal scuttles, less peaked than Soviet helms. One of them was carrying a large tin container. Steam rose from it. He was heading toward the women's compound. Michailova felt her stomach clench. For 3 years and 4 months, she had been a prisoner of the Third Reich. She had survived forced labor, starvation rations, disease, cold, and the particular brutalities reserved for Soviet prisoners whom the Germans classified as undermentioned, subhuman. She had watched women die of typhus, of dysentery, of simple despair. She had learned to make herself invisible, to take up as little space as possible, to avoid the attention of guards. And now the guards were gone, and British soldiers were coming, and everything she had been taught about the Western Allies was surfacing in her mind like debris floating up from a shipwreck. They are capitalists. They exploit the working class. They will treat you worse than the fascists because at least fascism is honest in its hatred, while capitalism hides its cruelty behind false smiles. They will use you and discard you. They serve the interests of the bourgeoisie. They are not your liberators. They are your enemies. The political commissar who had delivered these lectures in the winter of 1941, before Michailova's unit had been sent to the front, had done so with absolute conviction. She had believed him then because she had no reason not to. She had never met a British person. She had never been outside the Soviet Union. The world beyond the border was an abstraction, defined entirely by what she was told by those in authority. The British soldier with the tea container reached the gate of the women's compound. He was young, perhaps 25, with a sunburned face and a mustache that made him look older than he probably was. He fumbled with the latch. The Germans had locked it from the outside, and someone had shot the lock off, leaving twisted metal that caught on the gate frame. He set down the container, used both hands to force the gate open, then picked up the container again and stepped inside. 23 Soviet women stared at him. He stared back. For a moment, no one moved. Then he smiled, a small, uncertain smile, and said something in English. The words were incomprehensible. He gestured to the container, then mimed drinking. Then he said one word that Michailova recognized, badly accented but clear. Chai. Tea. That he was offering them tea. This was not in the script she had been given. This was not how enemies behaved. To understand the magnitude of this moment requires understanding what these women had endured and what they believed about those who now held their fate. The story of Soviet women in the Second World War is one of the least told chapters of that vast conflict, overshadowed by the larger narratives of male combat, of Stalingrad and Kursk, and the drive to Berlin. But the Soviet Union was unique among major combatants in deploying women in direct combat roles on a massive scale. Not as auxiliaries or nurses, though many served in those capacities, but as frontline soldiers with weapons in their hands and enemies in their sights. The BY 1943. The Red Army included all-female units of pilots, snipers, and machine gunners. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment, composed entirely of women, flew over 23,000 combat sorties. Female snipers like Lyudmila Pavlichenko were credited with over 300 kills. Women crewed anti-aircraft batteries that defended cities, drove tanks, operated radios under fire, fought as partisans behind enemy lines. They did this not because Soviet ideology was particularly progressive about gender. It was not, but because the Soviet Union was bleeding men at a rate that threatened its ability to continue fighting. Women filled the gaps. They proved themselves capable. And when they were captured, they suffered. The Germans did not recognize Soviet women soldiers as legitimate combatants entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention. In practice, the Reich did not recognize any Soviet prisoners as entitled to such protections. The Soviet Union had not signed the convention, and Nazi racial ideology classified Slavs as inferior beings to be exploited and discarded. Of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers who became German prisoners of war, nearly 3.3 million died in captivity, a mortality rate of 57%. For Soviet women POWs, the statistics are harder to establish because they were often not recorded separately, but their fate was at least as grim and frequently worse. They faced everything male prisoners faced: starvation, disease, forced labor, exposure, plus the additional vulnerability that came with being women in the power of men who did not view them as human. Those who survived did so through a combination of luck, cunning, mutual support, and sheer stubborn refusal to die. They formed tight networks within the camps, sharing resources, caring for the sick, maintaining discipline and dignity in circumstances designed to strip both away. And they clung to their Soviet identity, to the belief that they were soldiers of the Red Army, representatives of a system that, for all its flaws, had given them education and opportunity and a role in the defense of the motherland. But that belief was complicated by another reality. The Soviet state did not want them back. Stalin's Order No. 270, issued in August 1941, declared that any Soviet soldier who surrendered was a traitor to the motherland. This was not hyperbole or propaganda for domestic consumption. It was policy with teeth. The families of captured soldiers could be arrested. Soldiers who returned from captivity faced interrogation by SMERSH, Soviet military counterintelligence, on the presumption that they were either cowards who had surrendered voluntarily or German agents who had been turned. Many were sent directly to the Gulag. Some were executed. The women of Stalag XI-B knew this. They had known it from the moment of their capture. Liberation by the Allies was not unambiguous good news. It meant return to the Soviet Union. It meant facing judgment. When they looked at the British soldier with his tea container, they saw not just an individual, but a crossroads. He represented the West, the capitalist enemy they had been taught to distrust. But he also represented a delay, a liminal space before the inevitable return to Soviet authority. What happened in that space would shape their understanding of the world beyond the binary of fascism and communism. The soldier set the tea container on the ground and began pouring the steaming liquid into tin cups he produced from a satchel. He did this slowly, carefully, as if performing a ritual. The women watched. None moved forward. The cultural and ideological gulf was too wide to cross in a single step. Then one of the younger prisoners, Private Anastasia Sokolova, 19 years old, former anti-aircraft gunner, took a hesitant step forward, then another. She reached for a cup. The soldier handed it to her with a nod. She brought it to her lips, sipped, and her eyes widened. That tea was hot. It was sweet. There was sugar in it, real sugar, and milk. In 3 years of captivity, She had not tasted sweetened tea. She had barely tasted tea at all. The Germans provided ersatz coffee made from grain and acorns, or occasionally a weak infusion that might charitably be called herbal. This was something else. This was civilization in a cup. She looked at the soldier, and then she did something that surprised her as much as it surprised him. She smiled. Not a broad smile. Her teeth were in poor condition, several missing, and she was self-conscious about it, but a genuine expression of gratitude and astonishment. The soldier smiled back, broader now, and gestured to the other women. Come, drink. There is enough. One by one, they came. Mykolova was among the last, her sergeant's training making her wary of accepting anything without understanding the obligation it might create. But the tea was there, hot and real, and the British soldier showed no sign of expecting anything in return. She took a cup. The warmth spread through her hands, up her arms, into her core. She drank. The sweetness was almost overwhelming. Her body, starved of calories for so long, responded to the sugar like an engine given fuel. She felt tears prick at her eyes and blink them back. This was not how enemies behaved. This was not exploitation or cruelty hidden behind false smiles. This was a soldier who had thought to bring tea to people who had been hungry and cold, and who expected nothing more than that they drink it. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Over the next hours and days, the gap between what the Soviet women expected and what they experienced widened into a chasm. The British established a displaced persons processing area in the camp, segregating the prisoners by nationality to facilitate repatriation. The Soviets were grouped together, men and women, soldiers and civilians. Anyone who had been a citizen of the USSR. A British medical officer, Captain Andrew Harris of the Royal Army Medical Corps, visited the women's compound with 2 orderlies and an interpreter, a Polish woman who spoke Russian and English. Captain Harris was 41. A physician from Manchester who had volunteered in 1939 and spent the war treating casualties from North Africa to Normandy to the final push into Germany. He had seen horrors that would mark him for the rest of his life. But he had also retained a belief, perhaps naive, that medicine was a calling that transcended politics and nationality. When he entered the women's barracks and saw the conditions, the filth, the overcrowding, the gaunt faces and hollow eyes, his professional detachment cracked. He swore, fluently and with feeling, in English. Then he turned to the orderlies and began issuing orders. Within 2 hours, the women had been moved to a better barracks, one formerly occupied by German guards, with intact windows and functioning stoves. Bedding was brought in, rough but clean. A field kitchen was set up, and for the first time in years, the women ate something approximating a proper meal. Stew with actual meat, bread that was not sawdust-laced, tea with sugar and milk. Captain Harris examined each woman individually, documenting injuries and illnesses, arranging treatment for those who needed it most. He was gentle, professional, and entirely matter-of-fact, treating them as he would have treated British soldiers, as people entitled to care. This was, again, not what they had expected. Soviet propaganda had prepared them for Western doctors who would experiment on them, or at best treat them with contempt. Instead, they got a middle-aged man who looked tired and sad, and who seemed genuinely distressed by their condition. When he finished the examinations, he sat down with Mykolova, whom he correctly identified as the senior-ranking prisoner, and through the interpreter explained what would happen next. They would be fed and housed until they were well enough to travel. Medical treatment would continue. They would be issued new clothing to replace their rags. And then, when the Soviet repatriation officers arrived, they would be turned over to their own authorities for return to the Soviet Union. Mykolova asked the question that had been gnawing at her. What if we do not wish to return? The interpreter hesitated before translating. Captain Harris listened to the translation, and something shifted in his expression. He looked at Mykolova for a long moment, then replied. The interpreter translated, "That is not my decision to make. It is a political matter above my rank. But I can tell you that Britain and the Soviet Union are allies, and there are agreements in place regarding the repatriation of prisoners. My job is to see that you are healthy when that time comes. I wish I could tell you more." It was an honest answer, and Mykolova appreciated the honesty even as the content filled her with dread. She thanked him. He nodded and left, And the women were alone with their tea and their stew and their growing realization that the world was more complicated than they had been taught. The symbolic power of tea in British culture cannot be overstated, and its role in this story is both literal and metaphorical. Tea was the drink of the British Empire, the lubricant of social interaction, the response to crisis and celebration alike. Put the kettle on was the British answer to shock, grief, cold, boredom, or any other human condition. For the Soviet women, tea became the tangible representation of a different way of being, a society that had abundance enough to sweeten a drink for strangers, that valued small comforts, that treated hospitality as a default rather than a luxury. Every morning and evening, British soldiers brought tea to the displaced person's compound. It became a ritual, expected and comforting. The women began to time their days by it. Morning tea, evening tea. Sometimes there were biscuits, hard, dry things that nonetheless represented a kind of plenty they had not known. The tea was always hot, always sweet, always served without comment or expectation. It was civilization asserting itself in the wreckage of the war, and it stood in stark contrast to everything they had been taught about capitalism in the West. Where was the exploitation? Where was the cruelty? The British soldiers were not saints. Some were rough, some were indifferent, some stared too long, or made comments the women did not understand but could interpret by tone. But the overall tenor of the interaction was one of basic decency. The British treated them as displaced persons in need of care, not as ideological enemies or inferior beings. This created a crisis of understanding for women whose entire worldview had been shaped by Soviet education and propaganda. Private Sokolova, the young anti-aircraft gunner, voiced what many were thinking during a quiet conversation in the barracks one evening. If they are our enemies, why do they treat us better than our own side did? It was a dangerous question. Senior Sergeant Mikhailova, conscious of her role as a political as well as military leader, felt obliged to provide the correct answer. They do this to make us doubt, to undermine our loyalty. It is a tactic. Asterisk, but even as she said it, she doubted. A tactic to what end? The British were not trying to recruit them, not asking them for information, not offering anything except basic humanitarian treatment. If this was undermining, it was the gentlest form imaginable, and it was effective. Every cup of tea, every blanket, every visit from Captain Harris chipped away at the certainty that had been drilled into them 3 weeks into their liberation. A British education officer, Lieutenant Sarah Pemberton, one of the few British women the Soviet POWs encountered, visited the compound with books and newspapers. She spoke no Russian, but through the interpreter, she explained that she had been asked to provide educational materials to help the displaced persons pass the time while awaiting repatriation. The materials included Soviet publications, procured from somewhere, but also British and American newspapers and magazines. The Soviet women devoured everything. They read Pravda and Izvestia, the familiar language and familiar narratives providing comfort. But they also looked at the British papers, even those who could not read English. The photographs told stories. London, heavily bombed but still functioning. British civilians queuing for rations, so the West also had shortages, but also images of shops, of traffic, of normalcy. American magazines showed a world of abundance that seemed fantastical. Advertisements for cars, for household appliances, for foods the women could not identify. One image struck Mikhailova with particular force. It was an advertisement in an American magazine, Life, or perhaps Look, showing a family at a dinner table. The table was laden with food, roast meat, vegetables, bread, butter, milk. The family was smiling. The kitchen in the background gleamed with chrome and enamel. The caption, when the interpreter translated it, advertised an oven or refrigerator or some such appliance. But what struck Mikhailova was not the product being sold, but the world being depicted. This was presented as normal, as attainable, as the baseline American experience. It could have been propaganda, of course. Probably was. But even as propaganda, it revealed something. The West believed that abundance was an aspiration worth advertising, that ordinary people could expect comfort, that material prosperity was not something to be ashamed of, but something to pursue. This was antithetical to Soviet ideology, which valorized sacrifice and collective struggle and viewed material comfort as bourgeois decadence. Yet here she sat, warm for the first time in years, stomach full of British stew, drinking sweetened tea, wondering which system had actually delivered a better life to its people. The question was heretical. It was also inescapable. The British soldiers themselves provided another layer of education. They were conscripts, mostly working-class men from Manchester and Liverpool and Glasgow and London. They grumbled about the food, the weather, the delay and demobilization. They showed photographs of families, of homes, of lives interrupted by war. They played football in the spaces between barracks, their shouts and laughter carrying across the camp. They sang bawdy songs that made the interpreter blush and refused to translate. They were, in short, ordinary men who happened to be soldiers, rather than soldiers who had once been men. This ordinariness was revelatory. Soviet propaganda depicted the Western soldier as either a brutalized tool of capitalist oppression or a decadent weakling who could not stand against the hardened proletarian warrior. These British soldiers were neither. They were competent, disciplined when necessary, casual when not. They treated war as a job to be done rather than a sacred mission. And when it was done, they wanted to go home. One of the soldiers, a corporal named Davies, had a particular fondness for bringing tea to the women's compound. He was older than most, perhaps 35, with a limp from a wound taken in North Africa. He had daughters at home, he explained through the interpreter, around the same age as some of the younger Soviet women. He missed them. He wanted to be kind to someone's daughters in the hope that someone, somewhere, was being kind to his. This simple human reciprocity was a concept the women understood viscerally. It was not ideological. It was not tactical. It was just a father being decent. Corporal Davies became a fixture, arriving each morning with his tea kettle, staying to chat awkwardly through the interpreter, showing photographs of his girls, Emily and Margaret, 9 and 11. The Soviet women began to anticipate his visits, to save questions for him, to share their own stories through the halting medium of translation. When he learned that one of the women, Lieutenant Vera Ivanova, had been a schoolteacher before the war, he brought her a book, a children's book in English, simple and illustrated, explaining that Emily loved it, and perhaps it would help Lieutenant Ivanova learn some English. Ivanova, who had taught mathematics to 10-year-olds in Leningrad and had not thought she would ever teach again, accepted the book with trembling hands. That night, by lamplight, she began to read. Once upon a time, in a forest far away. The words were strange, the grammar alien, but the act of reading, of engaging her mind in something beyond survival, was transformative. She began to teach the other women, impromptu lessons in the barracks. English was the language of one of the great powers. It might be useful. It was certainly interesting. And it gave them something to do besides wait for the inevitable. The inevitable arrived on May 23, 1945. A convoy of Soviet trucks rolled into the camp, and officers of the Red Army, accompanied by SMERSH operatives in their distinctive uniforms, began the process of taking custody of Soviet citizens. The British, bound by the Yalta Agreement, complied. Captain Harris protested the haste. Several women were still recovering and not fit to travel, but was overruled by officers with more authority and less compassion. The repatriation would proceed immediately. The Soviet women were assembled in the compound. The mood was somber, fearful. They knew what awaited them. Interrogation, suspicion, possible imprisonment, possible execution. They had been captured by the enemy, which was itself evidence of either cowardice or treachery in the eyes of the Soviet state. The fact that they had survived German captivity would be held against them. Better to have died heroically. Michailova, standing at attention with her ragged squad, watched the Soviet officers approach and felt a complicated swirl of emotions. Relief at seeing her own people, her own language, her own flag. Fear at what would come next. And something else, something she had not expected, reluctance. She did not want to leave. Not because she had any illusions about staying in the West. That was not an option available to her. But because the 3 weeks in British care had shown her a glimpse of a different world. And she was not ready to close the door on that glimpse. Corporal Davies appeared at the wire, his tea kettle in hand. He saw the Soviet trucks, saw the Soviet officers, understood what was happening. He looked stricken. He set down the kettle and walked away quickly, shoulders hunched. Lieutenant Pemberton, the education officer, came to say goodbye. She brought with her a package wrapped in brown paper and handed it to Mykolova through the interpreter. "Books," she said, "for the journey." And after, Mykolova accepted the package but knew she would not be allowed to keep it. Soviet customs would confiscate anything from the West, especially printed material. But she thanked Pemberton anyway, and Pemberton said something the interpreter did not need to translate. The tone said it all. "I wish you well. I am sorry. I hope you survive what comes next." The British soldiers who had been guarding the displaced persons compound were replaced by Soviet soldiers. The atmosphere changed instantly. Where the British had been casual, the Soviets were rigid. Where the British had been solicitous, the Soviets were suspicious. The women were ordered into the trucks with an efficiency that bordered on brutality. Those who moved too slowly were shoved. Baggage was searched and largely discarded. Mykolova's package of books was confiscated without comment as the trucks rolled out of the camp. Mykolova looked back. Captain Harris stood near the gate, watching. He did not wave. She did not wave. But their eyes met, and in that moment, she understood that he knew. He knew what she was going back to. He knew what the Yalta Agreement had condemned her to, and he was powerless to change it, just as he had said. The journey back to the Soviet Union took weeks. A grinding odyssey through devastated Germany and Poland, across borders that had been redrawn by war, into the arms of a state that viewed its returning prisoners with suspicion rather than joy. The women were taken to a filtration camp, a euphemism for an interrogation and processing center where Smersh officers determined who was a loyal Soviet citizen and who was a traitor or spy. The interrogations were brutal. Where were you captured? Why did you surrender? What information did you give the Germans? The British? What did the British ask you? What did you tell them? Why did you survive when so many died? The questions were designed to elicit confession, to break down resistance, to find guilt even where none existed. The interrogators operated on the assumption that anyone who had spent time in enemy hands was compromised. Loyalty had to be proven, and the standards of proof were impossibly high. Mykolova, drawing on reserves of strength she had thought exhausted, answered every question with the same steady recitation of facts. She had been captured during the German offensive of 1942 when her unit was encircled. She had not surrendered. She had been overrun. She had given the Germans nothing but name, rank, and serial number. She had survived through luck and mutual aid with other prisoners. The British had liberated her camp and provided humanitarian care while awaiting Soviet repatriation. They had asked nothing. She had told nothing. There was nothing to tell. The interrogator did not believe her. How could she have survived 3 years in German captivity without collaborating? How could she have received kind treatment from the British without offering something in return? The ideology of the interrogation presumed that transactions required payment, that kindness was always a disguise for exploitation. The concept of genuine humanitarian treatment was literally incomprehensible within the framework of Soviet paranoia. In the end, Mykolova was classified as politically unreliable, but not a proven traitor. She was not sent to the Gulag, but she was not allowed to return to military service. She was assigned to a labor battalion, building infrastructure in a remote region of the Urals. It was punishment, but it was not death. Some of the other women from Stalag XI-B were less fortunate. 3 were sent to the camps for collaboration based on confessions extracted under duress. 1 was executed for espionage, the evidence being a British newspaper found in her possession. Private Sokolova, the young anti-aircraft gunner who had been first to accept tea from the British soldier, survived her interrogation and was eventually allowed to return to civilian life. But she was forbidden from discussing her captivity, forbidden from mentioning her time under British care, forbidden from acknowledging that she had ever been a prisoner at all. Soviet propaganda celebrated the Great Patriotic War as a triumph of Soviet strength and will. POWs complicated that narrative. They were airbrushed out, forgotten, denied. Sokolova lived another 43 years, dying in 1988, just as the Soviet Union was beginning to crumble. In the late 1980s, during Glasnost, she gave an interview to a journalist collecting oral histories of the war. She spoke carefully, still wary after decades of enforced silence. But she spoke. "The Germans were beasts," she said. "They treated us like animals, like things. We were numbers. Many died. I almost died. And then the British came. They gave us tea. With sugar. And milk. I know this sounds like nothing. But it was everything. It was proof that somewhere in the world, people were still human, that the war had not destroyed all decency. The British were capitalists, imperialists, everything we had been taught to hate. But they gave us tea and asked nothing in return. This confused me. It confused all of us. How could our enemies be kind? How could our allies send us to camps? I still do not have an answer. But I remember the tea. I will always remember the tea. The interview was published in a small circulation journal and went largely unnoticed. But it captured something essential: the power of small kindnesses to shatter ideological certainty, the way that human decency transcends political systems, and the tragic irony that the women were punished not by their enemies, but by their own state. The broader historical context of Soviet POW repatriation is one of the great tragedies of the post-war period. The Yalta Agreement of February 1945 stipulated that all Soviet citizens would be returned to the Soviet Union, regardless of their wishes. The Western Allies, eager to maintain the alliance and mindful of their own prisoners in Soviet-held territory, enforced this agreement with varying degrees of rigor. The British were generally more willing to comply than the Americans, though there were exceptions and local variations. Between 1945 and 1947, approximately 5.5 million Soviet citizens were repatriated from Western-held territory. Of these, an estimated 2 million were sent directly to the Gulag or to forced labor battalions. Many more were resettled in remote regions under NKVD supervision. The mortality rate among returnees was significantly higher than among the general population, both from the harsh treatment they received and from the psychological toll of being branded as traitors after surviving hell. The Western Allies knew what they were sending people back to. Reports from liaison officers and intelligence assessments made it clear that Soviet returnees faced interrogation, suspicion, and often imprisonment. But the geopolitical calculus of the early Cold War, still in its formative stages, prioritized Allied unity over individual fates. The British soldiers who had given tea and blankets to Soviet women had no say in the policy that returned those women to a state that viewed them as contaminated. This created a moral wound that many British and American veterans carried for the rest of their lives. Corporal Davies, the soldier who had brought tea because he missed his daughters, returned to Manchester and tried to resume his pre-war life. But he could not forget. In a letter to a friend in 1947, he wrote, "We beat the Nazis, and that was right. But we handed over people who trusted us to a different kind of evil, and I do not know how to reconcile that. I think about those Russian girls sometimes. I wonder if they're still alive. I hope they are. I hope they remember that some of us tried to be decent. I hope that counts for something." It counted for more than he knew. The Soviet women who survived their return carried with them the memory of British decency, and that memory became a seed of doubt about the absolute rightness of the Soviet system. They could not speak openly about it. They could not organize around it. But in private conversations, in whispered exchanges, they passed on the knowledge that there was another way of being, that not all capitalists were cruel exploiters. That propaganda was not the same as truth. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, the floodgates opened on suppressed histories. Memoirs were published. Archives were accessed. Survivors spoke. And a pattern emerged. Again and again, Soviet citizens who had encountered the West during the war, prisoners, forced laborers, displaced persons, reported the same cognitive dissonance. They had expected cruelty and found kindness. They had expected exploitation and found charity. They had expected propaganda to be true and found it to be false. This is not to say that the West was perfect or that capitalism was without sin. Western society had its own brutalities, its own injustices, its own exploitations. But in the specific context of post-war treatment of displaced persons, the contrast was stark. The British gave tea. The Soviets gave interrogation. That simple fact carried enormous ideological weight. Tea became, in the memories of survivors, a symbol of civilization. Not British civilization specifically, but human civilization. The idea that even in the midst of chaos and destruction, there was value in small comforts, in hospitality, in treating strangers as people deserving of warmth and sweetness. The Soviet system, for all its rhetoric about caring for the working class, had proven itself incapable of that basic kindness toward its own citizens. It valued ideology over individuals, collective purity over personal suffering. The appearance of loyalty over the reality of sacrifice. The women who had fought for the Soviet Union, who had risked and often given their lives in its defense, learned this lesson in the hardest possible way. They were discarded. The state they had served repaid their sacrifice with suspicion, and the enemy they had been taught to hate gave them in the decades after the war. As the Cold War hardened into a permanent division of the world, the story of Soviet women POWs was buried under layers of propaganda and silence. The Soviet Union did not want to acknowledge that its soldiers had been captured, that its women had been vulnerable, that its ideology had failed to protect them. The West did not want to dwell on the moral compromises of Yalta, on the people handed over to a fate everyone knew was unjust. But the women themselves remembered. They grew old in silence, carrying their secrets, their trauma, their small, fierce pride in having survived. When glasnost began to crack open the sealed histories of the Soviet experience, some of them finally spoke. Their testimonies were fragmentary, often tentative, shaped by decades of enforced reticence. But they spoke, and what they said, again and again, was this: the British were nothing like the propaganda. They were just men, tired men who wanted to go home. Men who brought tea because they had tea to bring, and because offering it was the civilized thing to do. Men who treated us like human beings when our own state treated us like traitors. This truth was destabilizing to Soviet ideology in ways that decades of Western propaganda could never achieve. It was not abstract argument or political theory. It was lived experience, concrete and undeniable. It was the taste of sweetened tea, the warmth of a clean blanket, the gentleness of a doctor who cared whether you lived or died. These small acts revealed the lie at the heart of the Soviet system, that it alone cared for the people, that the West was uniformly cruel, that there was no alternative to the Soviet way. There was an alternative. The women had tasted it, and no amount of interrogation or intimidation could erase that knowledge. The epilogue to this story is both personal and historical. On a personal level, each woman carried her experience differently. Some were broken by it: the war, the captivity, the return, the punishment. Some survived but never spoke. Some found ways to live with the contradictions, to reconcile their Soviet identity with their memory of Western kindness. A few, like Sokolova, eventually told their stories when the political climate allowed. On a historical level, the story is part of the larger tragedy of the Soviet experience in the Second World War. The Soviet Union paid an almost incomprehensible price for victory. 27 million dead, cities destroyed, entire generations decimated. The people of the USSR earned their victory through blood and suffering on a scale that the Western Allies, for all their sacrifices, did not approach. They deserved to be honored. They deserved to be welcomed home as heroes. Instead, those who had been captured were punished. Those who had survived were suspected. Those who had seen the West were contaminated. The state devoured its own children, not out of necessity, but out of paranoia and ideological rigidity. This was a choice, not an inevitability. Other nations honored their returning prisoners. The Soviet Union interrogated them, and in doing so, the Soviet state planted the seeds of its own eventual collapse. Because every person who experienced the gap between propaganda and reality, between what they were told and what they lived, became a carrier of doubt. That doubt spread, slowly and quietly, across decades. It was transmitted in whispered conversations, in unspoken comparisons, in the simple knowledge that things could be different. The women who drank British tea in the spring of 1945 were among the carriers of that doubt. They did not organize resistance. They did not distribute samizdat. They simply knew, in a way that could not be unknown, that their government had lied to them about the nature of the West. If that lie was false, what other lies might be false? If the British were not as cruel as claimed, what else was propaganda rather than truth? These questions were dangerous. They were also irrepressible, and in the long arc of history, they contributed to the slow erosion of Soviet legitimacy that culminated in the system's collapse. The Berlin Wall did not fall because of military defeat. It fell because people stopped believing. They stopped believing the propaganda. They stopped believing the promises. They stopped believing that the system cared for them. The Soviet women POWs had stopped believing decades earlier, when they compared the treatment they received from the enemy to the treatment they received from their own state, and found the enemy more humane. That comparison was the beginning of the end. Tea is a small thing, a beverage, a comfort, a ritual. But in the context of Stalag XI-B in the spring of 1945, it was a revolution in a cup. It was proof that abundance need not be hoarded, that kindness need not be calculated, that human decency could exist outside the framework of Soviet ideology. It was the crack in the wall through which light entered. The light did not save the women from what came next. Most of them suffered. Some did not survive. But the light was real, and the memory of it endured. In the decades that followed, when the Soviet system ground on with its gray brutality, when shortages and suspicion and the KGB's knock on the door defined daily life, those who had tasted British tea remembered that there was another way. That memory was a form of resistance, even if it was never acted upon. It was the knowledge that the system was not inevitable, not universal, not the final form of human organization. And when the system finally collapsed, when the archives opened, and the survivors spoke, that knowledge became part of the historical record. The Soviet Union lost the war of narratives in part because people like Sokolova and Michailova and the 21 others from Stalag XI-B eventually told the truth, that the propaganda was false, that the British were decent, that small kindnesses mattered more than grand ideologies. Corporal Davies, had he lived to see the collapse of the USSR, might have taken some comfort in knowing that his tea had been more than a gesture. It had been a statement that even in the wreckage of war, humanity persisted, that people could be kind to strangers without ulterior motive, that civilization was measured not by ideological purity, but by how one treated the vulnerable. He did not live to see it. He died in 1963, an ordinary man who had done his small part in an extraordinary time. His daughters, Emily and Margaret, grown women by then, remembered him as a quiet man who loved his garden and his tea, and who sometimes looked sad for no reason they could understand. They did not know about the Soviet women he had cared for. He had not told them. It was not the kind of thing one talked about. But history remembers, even when individuals forget. The story of the Soviet women POWs and their British liberators is a small story within the vast narrative of the Second World War. It does not feature in the major histories. There are no monuments to it. The women are long dead now, the last of them passing in the early years of the 21st century. But the story endures because it illustrates a truth that transcends its specific time and place. The truth is this: systems are tested not by how they treat their strongest, but by how they treat their weakest. The British system, flawed and imperfect, nonetheless extended basic human decency to enemy prisoners. The Soviet system, for all its rhetoric of worker solidarity, punished its own soldiers for the crime of surviving. That contrast reveals the essential difference between a society that values individuals and one that values only the collective abstraction. The women who experienced that contrast could not articulate it in those terms. They had not been trained in political philosophy. They were soldiers, workers, ordinary people caught up in extraordinary events. But they felt it. They knew it. And they carried it with them. In the end, the story of Soviet women POWs and British soldiers is a story about the power of small acts to reveal large truths. A cup of tea, offered without expectation, became evidence that undermined an entire ideological edifice. Sweetness and warmth, given freely, demonstrated that human kindness was not a zero-sum game, not a tactic, not a weapon, but simply what decent people did when they had the capacity. The Soviet women expected cruelty because they had been taught that capitalism produced only cruelty. They received kindness instead. That gap between expectation and experience was the crack through which truth entered. And once entered, truth is very difficult to dislodge. They were nothing like the propaganda. They were better. Not perfect. Not saints. Just ordinary men from an ordinary democracy, doing ordinary kindnesses, and in doing so, revealing that the world was larger and more complex than Soviet ideology allowed. That revelation was dangerous to the system. It was also liberating to the individuals who experienced it. The women paid for that liberation with interrogation, suspicion, and punishment. But they had seen a different world, tasted it in a cup of sweetened tea, and that memory could not be interrogated away. It remained a quiet sedition, a private knowledge that the propaganda was false. And in the long twilight of the Soviet system, that knowledge spread. Person by person, conversation by conversation, the truth leaked out that there were alternatives, that other ways of organizing society existed, that the West was not uniformly evil. The Soviet state tried to seal the borders, control information, punish dissent. But it could not erase the memories of those who had crossed over and returned. They were living witnesses to a different reality. When the system fell, it fell in part because too many people had seen through the lies. The Soviet women POWs were among the first. They saw through because British soldiers gave them tea. Simple as that. Profound as that. The story ends where it began, with ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances making choices that mattered more than anyone realized at the time. The British soldiers who brought tea did not think they were undermining Soviet communism. They were just being decent. The Soviet women who accepted it did not think they were committing treason. They were just thirsty, cold, and tired. But in the space between the offering and the acceptance, in the warmth of that cup and the sweetness of that sugar, a different world became visible. A world where kindness was possible, where enemies could be humane, where ideology mattered less than decency. That world was not perfect, but it was real. And the memory of it, carried by 23 women through interrogation and punishment, and decades of silence, became a seed from which doubt grew, and from doubt, eventually, change. The tea has long since gone cold. The women who drank it are dead. The British soldiers who served it are dead. The camps are gone, plowed under or turned into memorials. But the story remains, a testament to the power of small kindnesses to shift the trajectory of history, one cup, one person, one moment of unexpected humanity at a time. They were nothing like the propaganda. They were simply human. And that, in the end, was the most revolutionary truth of all. If you like the video, hit like, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more real WW2 stories every day. Thanks for watching.